I think that the role of law enforcement, if not purpose, certainly more so the role of law enforcement has changed, and it is changing rapidly right now. Uh, I think at one time we expected law enforcement agents, actors, to be keepers of the peace, maybe even to be safeguarders of property of people who were wealthy enough to own property. Now, law enforcement actors have a broader responsibility, and I think we expect more from them to ensure not just public safety in a broad sense, but fairness and consistency. Depending on the community, law enforcement agents act as social workers, mentors, arbiters, and I think that's fine. I think it is. What I'm struggling with internally is whether it's fair, because it's a whole lot to put on the shoulders of a police officer. We train them in the academies to follow the criminal code, criminal procedure against the backdrop of the Constitution, and they hit the street and we expect them to do all those other things that I listed. And most of the time they do it well, but it's hard.
We do need to have quite a bit of trust in the people that we give the power of a badge and a gun, because they are often placed in situations where they have to make very quick, on-the-spot decisions that can have drastic consequences for people. And we want police officers who not only know the limits of their power and know what the Constitution says, but we want police officers with good common sense and an understanding of the community benefit that they're serving.
When law enforcement officers overstep boundaries of power, really two consequences flow, both of which are negative. The first consequence is that whatever procedure they're involved in, they may not accomplish their goal. That is, if they gather evidence illegally, then when it comes to court, the evidence won't be usable. Under the exclusionary rule, the courts won't admit evidence that's legally seized. And what that means is that the goal of law enforcement is frustrated, because in those kinds of cases, a person who's guilty of the crime may go free because the evidence isn't available. But second, and I think even more important, the community's trust in the police is reduced. And when the community doesn't trust the police, the community will rely less and less on the police, and that will make it more and more difficult for the government in general to function. If people don't trust the police, they may not trust the rest of the government, and then what you have is you have the inability of the government to really administer the society the way it needs to in order to preserve liberty and to enforce the law. Many places that when the people stop trusting the police, it becomes more difficult for the prosecutors to get a conviction, because the juries don't believe the police officers. I actually personally sat on a jury in a case of drunk driving, driving under the influence case, where as soon as we got in the jury room, it was clear that a majority of the jurors didn't trust the police officer who had testified in the case, and that was going to determine the verdict, because they didn't believe what he said. And if you have a situation in which the people don't trust the police, where juries won't believe the police, and where everything the police do is suspect, it gets much more difficult to enforce the law in situations where law enforcement is needed. We see situations where the community loses trust in the police. For example, in Baltimore, after the death of a person in custody, the community gets in an uproar over that, rightly so, and it reduces the trust overall in the police. So it seems like in Baltimore, in the aftermath of that, the number of arrests was reduced, and it may be that the reason for that is that the community doesn't trust the police, and so when police are needed, they're not called. And this can be very detrimental to the safety of the community.
So I think that communities trust police and police departments when they are convinced that officers are making an effort to separate predators from people who are victims of circumstance, and where police departments recognize the intrinsic value in the residents of the community. where police departments go to great pains to avoid convicting young men and women of felonies where there's an alternative disposition. That gesture, that effort, yields an incredible return in the long run in the form of community trust. So modern community policing isn't just embedding officers for intel and embedding officers so that they can be present and shorten response time. Modern community policing really works well when the officer in the neighborhood can speak to a prosecutor and say, whatever Jen did on day one is not the Jen that I've come to know. The Jen that I've come to know could be a CEO of a company someday, could be a producer someday. This kid deserves a chance, or this mom is down on her luck, and that is why she's behaving the way that she is. Or a modern community police officer recognizes that people who live in poverty have tough decisions to make sometimes, and the crimes that they commit are as much a function, if not more a function of their circumstances than they are criminal triggers.